We're going to shift gears now. We're in the studio. Noam Cohen, the writer of his new book, The Know-It-Alls, is here with me. And we both know Vinny Mallozzi from the New York Times from the old days when we were all kind of kids together at the Times. And Vinny is now the wedding reporter at the New York Times on the style desk, society desk. Vinny, thanks for talking to us.
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure to be in the company of you fine gentlemen.
Always a pleasure. Right. That may be a stretch, my friend, but we'll try to get through this together. So thanks for coming in. And I kind of introed you earlier as saying, like, you know, back when we were all in sports and knocking around and that kind of thing, I mean, who would have known you would have been covering weddings for the Times? I mean, you were covering incarcerated basketball players. You were covering the Rucker League before anyone knew what Rucker League was, or many people knew what it was.
I maintain that I'm the only writer in history to have covered the men's sports pages and the women's sports pages. So I've lived it all in a single lifetime, my friend.
That's great. So how do you like doing this? I know you've been doing it quite a while now, but I mean, how does it compare? I should say, maybe the first question, how does it compare covering weddings to covering sports, you know?
Well, it's an interesting thing. When I first got the job, I didn't know what I was going to make of it. And then I started working on these stories, and you realize that there's, the one thing that I love sports. Sports has been just a part of my life, my whole life. I coached 3 kids in different sports, but the one thing I didn't like about sports was all those post-game locker room chats where I got one-word answers, from guys like Patrick Ewing and the like, yes, no, and, it's like beating your head against the wall to get a good quote out of some of these athletes.
Yeah.
But when you're writing in this, when you're covering this field, weddings, I mean, there's so many great stories out there, and people just want to, great anecdotes, and just a lot of good stuff to tell. In fact, last week I wrote a vows column about a wonderful couple who, where the bride found out that her dad, who had been sick with cancer, only had a couple of days to live, and they put together a wedding in 24 hours so he could see his daughter walk down the aisle, which was walk down the wedding aisle, which had been his lifelong dream. So, I mean, stories like that, really, really good stuff. And the best part is, our wedding section is one of the staple sections of the New York Times. It's a very, very, very well known and widely read section. So, I enjoy contributing to it.
Right. No, that's a good point. I mean, actually, both points. One is that, people might think that this is some kind of poofy stories, but they're as poignant as life itself. I mean, it can be painful, it can be poignant, it can be, laugh and cry type of deal. So, I mean, I do know where you're coming from in that regard. And number two is that, like you said, I mean, there, in one genre, it's very tough to get a quote or a substantial quote. A lot of these players don't want to talk to you. Meanwhile, most people who are getting married, they die to get into the New York Times.
Exactly. No one hangs up on the guy, covering weddings. You know what I'm saying? So
after they say I do, Vinny, you go
from the New York Times, and like I said, it's a wildly popular section, and I'm catching people at the best time in their lives, so everyone's usually in a great mood. So and that just opens the door to really good stories.
So, Vinny, you ask them after they say I do, like, what were you thinking up there? How were you feeling? Were you nervous? That kind of stuff. Yeah.
It's not like a post-match interview.
Is that no?
Yes. Yes.
What was that question?
I said you ask them, like, how are you feeling? What were you thinking up there? Were you nervous? You ask them, right after they say I do, or.
The questions kind of differ from the kind of questions I asked athletes, but I still write an occasional sports story, and every now and then I do ask. The two worlds collide every now and then. I can tell you that.
Well, the thing is about you in sports is that you really kind of specialized in, like, these backstory sports stories, and again, like, the kind of the heart, when you did a story, a lot of it was kind of off the court type of stuff. I can remember being a clerk in sports, and people would call asking for you because you were written these people up, and I can't tell you how many people were calling either from literally correctional institutions, calling for Vincent Mallozzi.
Well, yeah,
I mean, you did a lot of hard luck stuff, and right.
Yeah, unlike you guys who who grew up in the lap of luxury, I grew up in a difficult place. I grew up in East Harlem, New York, and loved basketball, and very poor. And
what was that like?
So I was sort of around these these grassroots stories where these guys who were swallowed up, good athletes were swallowed up by the inner cities, or in a city in New York and East Harlem, and being a basketball fan and I chronicled a lot of these guys' stories, guys like Joe Hammond and Pee Wee Kirkland, guys.
Who are those guys, though? I don't know if listeners know who that is. The GOAT,
Okay,
Earl Manigault.
These are basically guys who woulda, coulda, shoulda been professional basketball players, but they sort of lived undisciplined lives, and their lives went in another direction.
I think of Vinny
a guy named Richie Adams comes to mind. I remember the headline. He played at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas under Jerry Tarkanian. And we wrote the headline, "A Rebel Who Ran the Wrong Way." Mm-hmm. He ended up committing a murder, and he's serving life in prison right now. Just stomped on a girl's chest, and in a really vile, bloody scenario, and really got himself in big trouble. Got hooked on drugs, like many of these guys did, and just kind of wasted their lives away. And many of these guys, I wrote a book called
Asphalt Gods.
Asphalt Gods, yes, which the Times gave a nice review to, and I even think no one went out and bought a copy of it, for crying out loud.
Yeah. Wow.
So,
I was going to say,
that book sort of chronicled the lives of many of these players who had the talent to play at the professional level, but again, through various undisciplined actions, kind of like threw it all away. So,
but I think Vinny,
Joe Hammond, for example, is a guy who is the only guy in history. You hear about guys like Kobe Bryant and guys like Moses Malone, who never played a minute of college basketball and were drafted to the pros. Or how about a guy like Joe Hammond, who never played a minute of high school basketball and was drafted by the Lakers in 1971. I mean, these are just incredible stories from the streets. I've always been entertained by them, and I got to know these guys personally. And like you said, they were in and out of prison, and a lot of times, collect calls came in from various penitentiaries around the country.
Man. Yeah.
I was just thinking that, like, Vinny, more than like those stories, it's just that when you were writing about basketball, it was also the heyday. So you're writing about just the great, not only the hard luck stories, like the great players. You went to St. John's during that heyday. I mean, it's like the great time for New York basketball. That's what I kind of associate it with, even more than
it was. It was really a great time. I mean, St. John's had a powerful team back then, and everybody was really sort of in the hoops, and the Rucker tournament also was thriving as well. I mean, it sort of died down a little the past few years, but I mean, you had big players still coming to Rucker, Shaquille O'Neal and guys, Kobe Bryant, guys like that were still coming to Rucker Park. So basketball was on the minds of a lot of people, and these guys, I think I called it correctly. These were asphalt gods that. That people looked up to, I guess, more for their basketball prowess than anything else.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned growing up in East Harlem, Pleasant Avenue. People think of Rayo's, Mount Carmel Church. What was it like growing up at that time? I remember you telling me, for example, little things stick out, like the filming of the Godfather scene where the James Caan character, Sonny, beats up Carlo, the the boyfriend of his sister, with a garbage can top and stuff like that.
Yeah,
you watched that being filmed. Like, what was it like growing up in that neighborhood?
It was just an incredible. Well, I always said that the neighborhood I grew up in, East Harlem, on Pleasant Avenue, which was about a 6-block stretch between 114th Street and 120th Street, right off the East River. So, Pleasant Avenue, I always said, is basically East End Avenue for poor people. So, but growing up there, I always say it was. Up until about 1990, it was like 1965. It was sort of the land that time forgot.
Yeah, like Bronx Tale or something, right?
And I was there the day they filmed The Godfather. A couple of scenes where Sonny beats the heck out of his brother-in-law for misbehaving with his sister. And I was 6 years old. And I was holding my dad's hand, and every kid in the neighborhood was offered, or most of the kids, that famous scene where they're under the fire hydrant, and Sonny's beating the heck out of the guy, and all those kids are kind of around watching and stuff. Those are all my buddies that I grew up with, and I begged my father to let me be in the scene. He wouldn't do it. He said, I'll never forget, he said, "You're not a gangster." And I said, "Oh, come on, Dad, let me in." He wouldn't let me do it. And I'll tell you one thing. Had I been today, I really regret not having jumped into that pile of kids, because I could lay claim to the fact that I was in probably the greatest movie ever made.
Right. But your father kind of took the stance that we saw in The Bronx Tale with the De Niro bus driver character, is kind of keeping his son away from mobsters and gangsters, saying you know who the real man is, the working man, that kind of thing. So
yeah, it was kind of odd. He took that stance, and till this day, I still don't think he was right, but I see his point of view. But you're right, Corey, that was long before the script for A Bronx Tale was written. Maybe Chaz Palminteri was around and he heard a little of that conversation and inspired him.
Yeah, right. Now, Brent, let's fast forward again to now how you got this gig that you're at now. Like, talk about some of the aspects of, like, I wonder if there's something that you bring to this job that, you know, someone who, like you said, like you would think of the typical society reporter from the Times. Oh, the woman's here with the pearls and the dress and the wide-brimmed hat and the white gloves. You know, maybe that it's a total cliche and it never was or it isn't now. But I mean, maybe there is something that you could bring to a story about a wedding that, you know, someone a more refined sensibility maybe wouldn't bring to it. Someone who just knew that world of, you know, that kind of thing. Like, you're well-roundedness, and this isn't.
Well, here's the thing. Right? I think that my background in sports and for a long stretch, I wrote a lot of Metro stories too. So you know, I've written around the paper for many years before I got this job, and I think it got, you know, it sort of got me to the point where I kind of know what a good story is, and you sort of mentioned, I don't know if you used the words puff piece, but those are not the kind of stories I'm looking for. Good, solid,
I know that,
human interest stories. You know, it's just you know, weddings, Metro, sports, they're just stages upon which, you know, a writer can tell a good story if that's the right approach, if that's the approach you want to take, right. Which is the approach I always take. So I'm looking at the best stories when I'm reviewing possible ideas. You know, I'm looking for stories that are going to be gripping. Like I just gave you an example of the couple that worked 24 hours, put together the wedding of a lifetime for their dad, who, by the way, passed away literally hours after he saw his daughter walking down the aisle. I've done stories where a couple on death row, you know, managed to beat the rap on each side of the fence and got married. You know, just I've done a lot of stories, and I've done wedding stories on athletes. Ray Boom Boom Mancini comes to mind, you know, and talking about how he you know had to grieve the death of Dooku Kim, who he sort of beat to death, for lack of a better term, in the ring, and had to grieve that process before he was able to move on with his life. I mean, it's been a lot of really good, and another fighter, Iran Barkley, who got married last summer, and
the Blade, yeah,
Iran the Blade Barkley, yeah, who beat Tommy Hearns twice, and is living in the Bronx now, and he's battling a lot of these brain-related injuries suffered by fighters, and sort of how that's affected his life. And so these stories are a lot deeper than I think most people think. I mean, if you just have a puff, you know, when I look at a story and it doesn't have, you know, a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it's not, I always operate on a twin track, which I think you guys do too. You guys have both wrote beautiful pieces in the Times over the years. You're looking to inform and entertain, and that's what I try to do. I try to stay on that, on those, you know, one wheel on each of those tracks as I'm writing every story. And I think if you can do that, you know, I think you know that's you've accomplished something there. So in about a week, I'll be celebrating my 31st anniversary at the time. So I think hopefully I've done it well, and people have appreciated some of the stuff I put out there.
That's great. Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's a tendency to think, when I say puff piece, I mean, I'm talking about stories and people that get hijacked by, like, what kind of china are you having? What are you going to wear? Or what, you know, what color are the bridesmaids wearing? Is that magenta?
Yeah, yeah.
Or
well,
you
know what? That's some kind of, that stuff that is I guess, you know, of interest to certain people.
And you got to have some of it in there, I'm assuming, right? I mean,
but again, you know, I try to tell a story. You know, I try to still tell a story about people's lives and, you know, what makes people tick. And I think if you looked at the last 100 stories I've written, I don't think any one of them sound like the other.
Yeah.
Because I think that, again, I try to bring something fresh and new to the table every time. You know, obviously the bottom line and every, you know, the key, one of the key ingredients here is, you know, what was it about the other that, you know, attracted them to each other, and why, and when was the seminal moment maybe that they fell in love? If there was a seminal moment, sometimes it's gradual over time. But again, everybody has to have a backstory, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, the other writers might go in a different direction, but for me, there's got to be some teeth in the story. Everyone's got to have a backstory, as far as I'm concerned, to, you know, for me to be able to tell a good story. So,
well, now that you say that, let me do some what do they call the service journalism now, and say, How can our listeners get their wedding into the Times? I know it's a hokey question, but I'm just saying, like, what appeals to you or and the desk, and like, is it? I mean, obviously it's a good story, but people might miss the ball on
probably
that.
One of the most frequently asked questions in and around the newspaper for 100 years, actually. I mean, the first New York Times newspaper way back when had a wedding announcement in it. So weddings have been around since the beginning of time at the New York Times. And I always tell people, I'm not quite sure there's an answer to that. I think it's week after week. I think it's sort of a combination of factors. We don't want to ever have 10 doctors marrying 10 lawyers in a given week. I think we, like anything else, we try to spread things around. I think it's, for some couples, I think it's luck. For some couples, I think it's timing. For some couples, I think it's a variety of factors that you have to kind of roll in. Like, I'll look at, we get probably a couple of hundred submissions a week. So I always tell people that sometimes more, especially now we're in the teeth of the season. The wedding season is in full tilt right now. And I always tell people on the phone, they always ask, and I don't care, race, gender, social status, they always ask, why did you pick me? Mm. And I always tell them, well, you got picked because you were part of this week's puzzle, this week's balancing act.
There's a mix.
And everybody obviously wants the big kahuna, which is the big vows column. So we do 3 levels of announcements, the standard announcements. Then we have what we call our mini vows columns, which are 2 or 3 sort of announcements with backstories attached. And then there's the big full-blown vows column, which I'm working on one now about a couple who met on the set of Jeopardy. That's kind of a nice one, too. So
I think it's what is the couple that met on the set of Jeopardy, but okay, yeah.
Right, exactly.
No, what were you going to say?
Oh, I was going to say, like, Vinny, I've written like a book about tech stuff. I've been writing a lot about tech, and I think weddings are really interesting because they, as you must know, that like now that nothing ever ends, it's always online, and people, who get divorced, or you now have so much more detail that's on there. It's kind of the first thing people will find about people when they, look them up on Google and stuff. Is that something people talk to you about, or do you ever think about like how it's you're creating this like almost like the one thing people will find about someone online?
I know I do.
Yeah. And
and some people, by the way, we'll get some calls 5, 6 years later and say, hey, by the way, that wedding announcement you wrote, we're divorced now. Can you take it off? And I'm like, it doesn't work that way. That's there in perpetuity, my friend. So.
Right. Do you warn them of that beforehand? Like, you may get divorced someday?
No, we don't warn them. But I think it's fairly obvious to anyone in this day and age that once something goes online, it's there forever.
Especially in New York Times online, it's really forever. I mean, it's really the thing people will find, about them.
Right, exactly. So, and to the idea that someone's going to call back, and I mean, we get all sorts of questions and things and follow-up calls and stuff, and I always say that getting back to Corey's original question, I always say that we try to put together whether it's, we include some same-sex weddings, but we try to put together a balanced kind of report where we're telling people who these people are, what they do, what their parents do, that kind of thing. So, and again, getting back to what I was going to say before is, I always tell people in the summer, they say, how did I get in? I say, I'm not quite sure how you got in, but I do know that for every one person we have in this week, 10 people didn't make it. Wow. And that's because, we only have so much amount of space based on advertisement and stuff like that. But again, it's a wildly popular section, and but, I get so many requests and different story ideas. And
when you say that, when you say that's not the way it works, you can't take it down. Of course, I should say that is a big debate. In Europe, there is this whole idea of the right to be forgotten, and it's one of the things that they argue about. In Europe, they're much more willing to say that you could take yourself down, and like they want to give more control. But
then who's to say that it hadn't happened? In other words, you can't unring the bell. So I mean, we are the paper of record.
Right,
and that's what happened at that time. We're not going to start.
Have you ever done
it? Do you do it for news and not for features?
Large texts of history that
That's one of the issues. Do you ever do follow-ups with people? Like, have you done that yet?
Oh yeah. We do a column where we talk about we go back and revisit couples and how they're doing, and sometimes they're doing well, and sometimes they're not doing so well. So yeah, we definitely do follow-ups and stuff, and and we do a lot of sidebar, offbeat stuff. Brides' wedding dresses, what they wore, and rings to wear, and there's just something for. I think there's something for everyone in there, you know. Mm-hmm. And like I said, I think I have an eye for what makes a good story, and I enjoy telling them. And this sort of there's a lot of latitude here, you know. When I'm writing a story, there's a lot of good information, a lot of great anecdotal stuff, and you know, sometimes you interview a couple though, and it goes the other way. You know, sometimes it's like, oh my goodness, why did I select these people? They're horrendous. It's like pulling teeth, you know, getting a quote. But and that takes me back to my sports days. But for the most part, you know, what I do is I pre-interview most people, and oh, by the way, that column where we revisit people and stuff is called State of the Unions, in case anyone was wondering. Yeah. It kind of gives you an idea as to what, sort of an update on people, but. For the most part, I pre-interview just about everyone. It's a tedious job because from start to finish, you're working on a vows column. I pick a couple. I get a kind of a feel for what their story is about, kind of get a feel for what they're about. So I interview them for a few hours. And then based on that, you know, I might be interviewing another couple for a pre-interview for a few hours. And then you kind of have to whittle things down. And then you know, and then you go to the wedding, and then you're writing again, and then you send in a first draft, and sometimes the editing is tough. But I try to get my voice in all these pieces, and you know, the idea is to you want to hit home run every time. So you know, that's my goal, and you know, like I always say, Corey, my fan club meets in phone booths. So I don't
think that's true.
I don't know what the feedback is, but
yeah, Vinny. One thing is that I think a lot. Maybe this is kind of passé now, but like the rap against the Times vow stuff is like, oh, you have to have gone to Bryn Mawr. You know, it's blue blood stuff. You know, but has that? I mean, I know that's changed, but I mean, do people still play that up? I mean, a certain type of person play that up. Oh, my father's from Swarthmore. I don't know. I'm throwing out names. You know, that kind of stuff.
Well,
old money.
The idea is, you know. I always tell people, and let me preface this by saying that I'm one of the people who, when I joined society, and this was 14 years ago, railed against that kind of stuff where, you know, Harvard, Princeton, you know, like you just said, all those the Ivy League connections and the whole thing. And I always said, and I think I made some inroads here. I always said, you know, what about the postman who marries the gym teacher? You know what I mean? I mean, it's got to be something for everyone. Couple of things there. One of the problems is that we can't go out and cast a net and haul people in like, you know, we're fishing out at sea. They have to come to us. So the people who are coming to us are often these Ivy-educated people, okay? Now, we do our best to try and find people who are, you know, not doctors and lawyers, who are sort of everyday, ordinary type of people. But unless they come to us, we're not going to be able to find them. So, you know, we have little boxes in the paper that sort of urge people to send in their stories and stuff like that. But we, you know, the section is for everyone. The section is for everyone. Black,
that means they're Times readers, though. So in some ways you're limited that way by who reads the Times. You know.
Well, yeah, right, exactly right. So I mean, people who are not familiar with the section and don't know. I've met people, you know, down the line say, "Oh, if I only known, I would have sent it in." I said, "Well, you know, you kind of do have to be a Times reader at some point." You know, you have to kind of be in the know to kind of be in the mix.
It's true. Although I've had people who ask me who aren't Times readers, but they know that the Times is a big wedding, you know, like listed into them. Listing, can you get my daughter's getting married? Can you get it? And they don't read the Times, but they know that it's the place to be mentioned. You know that. So I mean, yeah, it's a little wider than just the readership, maybe.
That's true. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I can tell you that when we do cast a light on these people, whether it's a major vows column or just an announcement, I mean the feedback I get from some of these people who say they haven't, you know, they've gotten calls from all over the world from people they hadn't seen in years and or hadn't heard from in years. It's pretty amazing. So, you know, it really is. Many couples have told me that outside of the actual wedding itself, being in the Times wedding pages was really the highlight of really the whole, probably the second best thing that happened to them since getting married. So
it's like the ultimate.
It's a big deal, and people, and I can also give you some little. This is stuff I never talk about, but because I know you guys from way back when, I can honestly tell you that, you know, some of the backstage, if you will, there's a lot of backstage bickering. some couples, you know, I get some calls from people who say, why am I not in the vow? Why am I not vows worthy, meaning the big vows column? And I'll be like, well, it's not that you're not vows worthy. It's just that, you know, we decided to go in this direction. At some point, editors and writers have to make a choice which road they want to go down in terms of working on a story. I had a guy once, we had done a column on it was a guy, let's say the guy was a shoe salesman. That part is fictitious, but the real part is this guy was a weatherman. And a fairly well-known weatherman. And he said to me, how is that shoe salesman more important than a weatherman that everyone knows? And I said, well, you know, that's not how we think here. You know what I mean? That's not how we do things here. We don't operate that way. We don't favor
the best story,
someone because they make more money, because they're more famous. And I think that's the beauty of the section, too, is that everyone's sort of spread out equally. You know, there isn't somebody who stands out. I mean, I've covered, you know, Trump Jr.'s wedding. I've done weddings on Rockefeller.
Back up. Hold on. Wait, you thought you were going to just let that pass?
In the original Russian, or was it
Come on, Vinny.
Got quiet, Vinny.
Give us the deal.
What's that?
I said, was it in the original Russian, the ceremony, or did you?
Yeah, was there a Russian contingent at the wedding, or what?
No, come on, guys. I'm not going there. Come on.
Sorry.
You guys are
hey, you brought it up, man.
No, I'm just trying. The point I'm trying to make is that, you know, this section is for everyone, and the Times is, you know, all in on being all inclusive. You know, same-sex weddings. You guys see them every week out there. You know, and it's a fascinating job. I mean, it really is. I mean, it's not just what someone might think from afar. It's just like, oh, these puff pieces, these boring stories. They're not that. Yeah. You read these vow stories, they're really well. I'm not speaking for myself. I'm just talking the section in general. Yeah. They're really well written stories, well thought out.
They're ultimate, you know, like I say, the ultimate story about marriage. You know, marriage is ultimate.
All right, we're gonna have to club. Vinny, thanks for coming on, man. We're getting short on time, but I appreciate you coming on. And listeners, you should, if you want to see something really good on Times Video, sometimes they do a great job at actually covering their own. Look up New York Times. He used to cover sports. Now, love. It's the story of Vinny Mallozzi's journey from being a sports reporter to a weddings reporter. And Vinny, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. Everyone else.
Hey, guys, I'll wait for the check in the mail. Thanks a million.
Okay. Just
Take care, boys.
Another We and Me talk back in the books, and we'll see you in a few weeks after the fundraiser.